Unfiltered. I'm your host, Blain, and I'm joined by a very, very special guest today, Sam Jefferies, a University of Wisconsin-Madison alum. He's a freelance writer and comms professional in Seattle, and his work has appeared in several journals, Sports Business Journal, Sports Classics magazines, Seattle Times, Newsweek, and all kinds of other places. He's been extremely busy and prolific. So welcome to the show, Sam.
Thanks, Blain. Thanks for having me. It's fantastic to be here.
I've been really looking forward to this show after reading your novel Legacy on Ice, the Blake Geoffrion story. It 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 covered so much, not just with Blake and his background, but hockey in general in the States, in Wisconsin, and I'm sure there was a bunch of other stuff that wasn't covered. But what my question to you is, what made you write this book, and how did this idea take seed?
Sure. So yeah, I kind of like you said at the top, I'd been writing for a few different outlets, and I'd write a story about my grandfather or about fishing or hunting or whatever it was, and I finally had a friend of mine say, how was the writing on it? I said, it's going great. And he goes, how many pieces have you sold? And I said, well, I've sold all of them. And he goes, it's too easy for you. You got to write a book. If you were to write a book, well, do you have any ideas? And I said, well, actually, I have this incredible story that has been in my mind for a long time. And I had gone to the University of Wisconsin at the same time that Blake did, and was there when he won the Hobie Baker, but knew his family history, knew the background of Boom Boom and Howie Morenz and all that. And so I started to dig into it a little bit here and there, and really realized, part of what you said, that this guy is like the Forrest Gump of hockey. He pops up in all of these strange places with no reason, right? Like there's no reason for Blake Geoffrion, who had a relatively short pro career and certainly not going in the Hall or anything, to have been a central figure for the rise of the NTDP and the return of USA Hockey and the renewal of the US Canada juniors rivalry. And yet, he's right there, right? His roommate's Patrick Kane when they're at the program in Michigan. He's at the center of this major change in college hockey, right? And in the NCAA grappling with, the post 04 CBA and what that meant to the game. And then, here he is in Montreal in 2012 during that lockout, and playing with Brendan Gallagher and inheriting this legacy that began when Howie Morenz first laced up back in the 1920s. And so the more I dug, the more I found that I could tell his story, and I could tell all of these stories about North American hockey, and that was such a cool thing for me, that you follow it deep enough and you've got the Sedins playing at the World Juniors, and then take it another direction, and you got Boom Boom Geoffrion inventing the slap shot, and then coaching his son Danny and having it all go to hell at the end of the 1970s, just when the Habs are coming off the true dynasty years. And so it was such a fascinating journey for me, and I figured, well, if I found it that interesting, I'm probably not the only one, and I think that's the case. I gotta here I am with the book now.
Well, it was very interesting reading the path that you followed in that. Clearly, you covered a lot about the U.S. being an
Right.
American. That makes perfect sense.
Sure.
For those of us, this is a Montreal Canadiens podcast, so we understand that legacy that he has through the Montreal timeline with his great grandfather, all four of them. I remember, because I'm much, much older. Uh, I remember him coming into the league. I remember him being drafted. It was a huge deal for him
Yeah.
to be drafted to even to Tennessee. Uh, Being a Tennessee kid, that made
Yep.
that was historic. But being a fourth generation, so for us, for my on my end, I loved going back into this story, and I wanted to know, what kind of research did you have to do to get into it?
Uh, I spent a long time and a lot of time talking to anyone and everyone I could possibly reach about this. And I had a really cool conversation with a guy named Glenn Stout, who is the longtime editor for Best American Sports Writing Series. And, Glenn really laid out for me to tell a great sports story. You've got to do it from multiple perspectives. You got to do it from the guy who's playing, from the guy he's playing against, from the coach, from the fan, and from the media, right? And so in order to do that, tell it from essentially like 5 cameras on a single game. And so in order to do that, you've got to talk to all 5, but not every opponent's going to give you a good interview. So you got to keep chasing it down. And so I did a ton of that. I talked to trainers, I talked to coaches, opponents, teammates, Blake, his mom, his dad, his now wife, all these different people to try and piece that together. And then spent a ton of time in the archives, right? Reading the old newspaper articles and gamers and watching documentaries about the Richard riot and everything I possibly could. And then I'll tell you the most excruciating part for me, I really wanted to cover the U18 IHF U18 tournament that the Team USA ends up winning the gold medal in, and it kind of it helps cement that national team development program as a renewed competitive U.S. team. And I contact the IHF, and they say, we've got all the tape you want to watch, but unfortunately for that tournament, we lost all the sound. And so I end up sitting there and I'm watching hours of a hockey on mute and just recreating it, right? Sitting there with the box score and with the roster and like writing, trying to rebuild these games and essentially write a gamer, which is kind of focused on Blake, but not too much, and then rewrite it so that it actually is relevant beyond just the game itself. So, I mean, I love hockey. I've watched a lot of hockey in my life. That was a painful weekend, I'll tell you that.
I've done a lot of video scouting over the years
Mm-hmm.
for this career and another.
Sure.
And I have to say that, yeah, without the sound and without that digital marker that they give us now,
Right.
uh, it would be so painful.
Yeah. Yeah. This is me, pen and pad, just
Yeah.
rebuilding it. And but anyway, I really do think it contributed to it, and then, led to that the next year, the 2007 World Juniors, and it ends up being the shootout, and it's Patrick Kane against Sidney Price, and I mean, it's just a really, really cool moment. So there's a lot of great stuff in there that I ended up, finding after doing all that digging.
Well, I personally enjoyed that game myself, but
Yeah,
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 for obvious reasons. But
for
my
sure.
God, what a game it was! What a game
Yeah,
that was! It was incredible. Um, but that takes me a little bit to you went right into the grassroots of it,
yep,
not just the NCAA or Team USA, but the actual grassroots. You went down to Culver Military Academy
yep.
where Blake went to school before all this started.
Totally. No, and that was, one of the better parts for me, because I think so much of Blake's story is that he's he's kind of an unremarkable player coming from where he did. He doesn't have the flash and the pizzazz of Boom Boom, or of Howie Morenz. I mean, the Stratford streak, and going back to Culver Military Academy, talking to his coaches, talking to the guys who built that program, and they all had funny Boom Boom stories, because he would come visit, and he'd be growling at them and saying, my son should be playing here for free, and just classic Bernie stuff. But it was that military mentality, it was that early on military training that Blake got and done. And I mean, it is not it's not just a boarding school, right? Like they run it in a serious way, and he learned that and instilled it, and I think continues to be shaped by it to this day. But yeah, I got to talk to those guys, and hearing what he was like at 14 told me a lot of what he was going to be like at 20, which is probably true for all of us, right?
Yeah, I found that being someone with a military background myself, albeit quite different from a military academy, I don't think I would have been
Right.
doing too well at 14 doing that. But I found that that might have been the most important shaping aspect of his hockey career, not just
Yep.
outside of, obviously outside of hockey, but it gave him that discipline and focus that it seemed
Yep.
that he needed to get to that next step.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's learning to learn too, right? And
Yeah.
really having that ability to be coached later on and to have the discipline to know who you are and really what you can ask of your body. But at the same time, then also to be coached and to, to take orders and go the direction that the team needs. And, all these kids when they're 12, they're the stud of their team, right? And they're the goal scorer and it's easy for them to be up front and rack up points and all that. And so many of them don't survive that crunch when they get to the next level, whatever level that is, and realize that, they can't play through it. And I think Blake being in a military infrastructure really allowed him to do that, right? And taught him that self-discipline to take some adversity and to get through it and then to, listen to the smart people around you too, and not be such a hothead.
Now, it seems that that really helped him, especially with having to move to Michigan to
Hmm.
play in the program. Now, you go into the chapter USA Hockey, and you looked at the inception of the program, and what, for me, someone who is already an adult by the time it started, I saw the '96 World Cup win by the States being the really
Sure.
that pivotal point that really set them off and got people interested in it. But what impact did you find from that Ron DeGregorio brainchild have on U.S. hockey and on Blake in general?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, enormous, right? And actually think the 96 World Cup was the anomaly, right? And that told them
Yeah.
that, hey, we got away with one here. But this could be the beginning of the end if we don't change something. And, fundamentally, there's a great quote in the book about there being more players from Ontario than there are from the entire United States and the NHL at the time. And so, we were talking about earlier, you have these different factors that are shaping the people who are playing the game, right? And the decision by the Olympic Committee to allow NBA basketball players to play changes so much because then the NHL, all the other pro teams want to get in. Well, then having American players in the NHL becomes a lot more important because if they don't, then Miracle on Ice in 1980 is just history and it'll never be repeated and it'll never happen again. So I got to interview Ron DeGregorio and some of these other folks who built this vision and this vision of embedding 44 kids year round, which is heavily criticized. And so many people said it's too much money on too few kids. You're gonna get nothing from this, and it's all gonna go bust. And it was fought tooth and nail. Um, and of course, we know that's not true. They won the World Juniors again this year, which I think is the benefit to the Canadians because when Canada's walking to 3 out of every 4, gold medals, it's just not that interesting. Steel sharpens steel, and it's always a better game when you have a true rivalry. And so that USA hockey program was so tenuous in the early years, and that North American development model that's come out of it was very experimental and controversial. And you had, a lot of criticism and a lot of hate for taking our money and taking our boys and putting them in Michigan, which God forbid, right? That you take the Massachusetts kids and the Minnesota kids and you put them in Michigan and, you're going to screw up the whole NCAA and you're going to ruin high school hockey in Minnesota and all that. And of course, that's proven not to be true. The benefit has spread broadly, right? And it's spread to places like Tennessee and Arizona, Austin Matthews, and elsewhere. But it really took those early years, and it took Mike Eves and Mo Mantha and these guys to be able to prove, hey, we can win, we can go, we can be competitive, we can beat the best, and I mean really good teams, right? Like those mid-aughts World Juniors teams on both sides of the border were absolutely incredible. And but it took a belief in that program and proof of concept to be able to say, okay, Di Gregorio was right. We're going to do this. We're going to commit to it year round. And then, the proof's in the pudding. Here we are 20 plus years later. And it's the Swedes are changing things to look more like the American model.
Yeah, and I've noticed a lot of a bleed out from the program into uh, other programs throughout the United States. I travel
Totally.
quite a bit. I've gone through the States. I love watching junior hockey, and I even go to high school games and prep school games.
Sure.
And you can see a lot of these development camps that they have to find their players. They actually spend more time with the kids and help develop those skills in the kids that aren't going to make it to the program, who
Yep.
then take that back to their schools, and it just snowballs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it snowballs within the programs themselves and then also geographically, right? So I live in Seattle, but you see they have the benefit of a USA Hockey model that has been refined so often. And then, of course, you see American players, right? And you see, whoever it is, Patrick Kane or TJ Oshie or, whomever, um, being a sweater that you can hang on the wall in the ring too, and that's great. But really taking those skills, that skill building, and then pushing it down all the way down the pyramid is noticeable. Has a real effect, and the more kids playing, the more better kids playing longer. And then you've got places to send them too. College hockey is expanding. There's college hockey in Arizona now, and in Long Island, New York, and different places. And so that continues to feed into just a stronger and stronger base. And then the tip of the pyramid ends up being even more valuable.
Now, this is something that I always have a bit of a I'm torn in two ways. So Blake, clearly hockey royalty from Canada. His dad is Canadian. He has dual citizenship, but he
Yeah.
chose to play in the States. Clearly, he grew up there. That's where his heart is. But that decision to play internationally for one versus the other, did you go into that at all with him?
Some, he interestingly enough, for all of the family history that he has, um, none of his dad and his grandfather didn't play internationally for Canada. A lot of it was just timing, and then boom, boom, was a very young pro and ended up. I mean, you're playing on a line with Maurice Richard, you're probably that's the call you're going to take, right? But he this was the first opportunity that was presented to the family, and for him, I think really for Danny, for his dad, he had a tough time. He came up through Quebec Major Juniors and was a real star in that, and was drafted by Montreal, ended up going WHL instead, and then um, when the league collapsed, came back to the NHL, Habs at his rights, and just as that happens, they go into a coaching transition, and he has to play for his father, who he didn't really know because he's off playing pro hockey, and Danny's living with billet families and bouncing around the juniors league. So that was a hard thing for him, a really really hard thing for a father and son who didn't really know each other to all of a sudden be under the microscope of Montreal hockey, which is there's no brighter microscope, right? Um, that's the big one, and in the late 70s, no less. Um, and have it not work out. I mean, he never scored a goal, wearing the sweater, and he gets traded to Winnipeg, and then, a year later he's out of the league entirely because he played Japan, and so I think when he left Canada, he left Canada. He came to
Yeah.
the States. He really set aside that part of his life, and so Blake's first I think his first trip to Montreal was the day his grandfather had passed away, and they were going up to they were going to the Bell Center to see his number retired, and he didn't truly realize until then what that legacy was. It's just so funny because here it is, that really being kept, right? The like
Yeah.
Quebec, the keepers of the hockey history, and being kept while he's away, and he's not aware of it because he's growing up in Nashville, and then going to play in these American systems. So I don't think it was really a question for him, although I do know it pained his grandfather somewhat, and he made a real point to walk across that USA logo every time he was coming into the locker room, which, I'm sure he had a few words about with John Hines.
I'm sure the words were very quick and brusque. I mean,
Oh
Boom
yeah,
Boom was well known for his quips, his
yeah,
one-liners. So
absolutely, yeah.
I can only imagine how colorful that language might have been. Um, so from that point on, he had a great junior career, and then he got recruited to go to Wisconsin. So did you go into what his decision making was behind that, being someone who was at Wisconsin at the same time?
Yeah, yeah. So I talked to him a lot about it. And, similarly, because he grows up in Nashville and his dad's not American. So he's a bit of a free agent, right? And,
Yeah.
he's not being pulled by Boston College or Minnesota or anything. Um, and then Wisconsin, was a phenomenal program at the time. Now their program has gone through a downslope, and then really a revival this year. Um, but at the time they were the season he was being recruited, they ended up going on to win the national championship, and they beat Boston College, and Brian Elliott's a Hobie Baker finalist, and just an incredible team. But he really talked about seeing that discipline that he'd grown accustomed to first at Culver and then at the national team development program where Mike Hughes had coached as well. And so I think it was a really comfortable thing for him to be able to, you know, step right into that. And that as much as that pressure is like, when you turn coal into a diamond, right? He really thrives under that pressure. So I think that was a big part of it for him. And then, I mean, Wisconsin's just an incredible place, too. The campus, and I had two uncles play hockey there for Badger Bob Johnson back in the 70s. And I remember one uncle, they asked him, where else you looking? He was at up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at the time, and they said, who else is looking at you? And he said Wisconsin, and they go, oh, go to Wisconsin. It's such a cool campus, and the girls are beautiful, and the hockey's great, and the rink is exceptional, and the history is phenomenal, and so it's they've got a good explanation point at the end of their sentence when they're recruiting. That's for sure.
No doubt. I've had the good fortune of going around some NCAA rinks, and I've been to the Wisconsin Badgers campus and checked it all
Yeah.
out. I would have been sold too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's quite a place. So we were there. We did a book signing there back in the fall, and went around the locker rooms. And first of all, my favorite part of the whole thing though was they're in the locker room, and they've got the false rink on the floor and all that, and they've got the lockers, and every locker has every Badger who's worn the number before it, and cool stuff like that. Um, and then they have the biggest mirror you've ever seen. And in front of it is the biggest selection of hair products you could possibly imagine, and combs and brushes and mousse and gel and pomade. And these boys are just sitting there working the lettuce. It was something else.
It's like watching. So my son's a teen. He's playing high level hockey here.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. 13, 14-year-old
Oh
kids.
yeah.
It does not change.
Yep. Yep. Like enjoy while you can, right? You got hair, you might as well I know, man.
Yeah.
Going fast.
Well, it's still got color and still got some volume. I
That's
mean, those
right.
kids just
Yeah,
go at it.
exactly.
I don't think I was any different when I was that age, so it makes
Right,
sense.
right. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Now, I grew up in Canada, Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec, um, and junior hockey was the thing. But having traveled and gone through the states, the NCAA is the show for a lot of these
Yeah.
kids down there.
Yep.
So, how big is it? how big of a business is it to actually go out and recruit these kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think Wisconsin's a great example where in the mid 2000s when Blake got recruited, well, that rink has 18,000. Kohl Center seats 18,000. And the year that Blake was recruited, they had more home fans, more fans on average per home game than the Chicago Blackhawks. I mean, people are coming out in a very, very big way for college hockey. There's an intensity and a fanaticism, and for a long time, it mirrored the programs where the football wasn't so good. So if football was bad, then they really invested, their heart and soul into hockey, and it became great. And then they fell in love with hockey, and then that's all they wanted, right? And it became the love to them that is to guys like you and I. And then, the recruiting is really it's very interesting because they want so much cream of the crop from Canada, and there's always been that battle between the juniors and the NCAA's, and the juniors boosters really like to say that it's a soft league and there aren't that many games, um, which is true. Like there are so many fewer games, but because of that, you're practicing 6 days a week and you're doing that skill building and that fundamentals, and especially if you're 18, 19, 20, the advantage of that is so significant that you're not grinding out, time in the bus leagues, right? And bop around northern Quebec and having somebody punch you in the face who's 5 years older, right? Like that's a tough sell. So um it makes that it's just a different appeal to Canadian players. And I was Wisconsin a couple years ago when Cole Caulfield and Keandre Miller and Dylan Holloway and Alex Turcotte, all those guys were playing for Wisconsin. They played an exhibition series against University of British Columbia, and I went up, and it was really interesting because they're limited in the amount. I think they can play one of those series every few years. It's a
Yeah.
small number. And so that exhibition, that showcase is so important to them and keep that pipeline coming. And Wisconsin has had a pipeline to BC, for example, which is how Kyle Turris ended up there, for a long time. And building that comfort level is really, really important to those NCAA programs so that they can balance it with the homegrown kids from across the US too. So it's a big deal. And the competition is fierce. And then, sometimes they lose it in the opposite direction too. And
Yeah.
Patrick Kane went up, played in London, Ontario. And there are American players who choose to bypass that for their own reasons. So and now we're in a new era with the transfer portal, and they're really cognizant of what playing time looks like means, and that coaching affinity, because those guys can ship off next season just like any free agent.
Now, kind of staying with the grassroots part and the NCAA, um, having grown up in the junior systems up here in Canada, we have billet families.
Yep.
Clearly, there's this similar idea down in the States with your programs, and they're the untold heroes and untold stories in the game. Now, you have a couple of stories about some of these guys in your book, specifically one out of Wisconsin, Bob Lendauer.
Yep.
Could you tell us a little bit more about him? Because
So
that
Bob's my
story
guy.
just
I would,
pops.
yeah, I could talk about Bob till the cows come home. He's a phenomenal guy. He's a tradesman out of Wisconsin, and is just a true believer in the program. Has been for decades and decades, and he's an amateur stat keeper. Keeps the stats, and then has become an ESPN contributor through that lens. And but is the guy in August who's moving these kids into the dorms, who really plays like that billet dad kind of role, and takes so much personal pride and ownership and these guys' path, and takes a lot of pride in their success, no doubt, but also just in their growth as well. Going from boys to men sounds cliche, but like he truly believes that, and you need guys like that. And I didn't find Bob until pretty late in my research, and then did end up getting connected. Somebody said, if you haven't spoken to Bob Lindauer, you need to. And I talked to him, and I mean, that guy had moved everybody into the dorms who, to Danny Heatley and Joe Pavelski and all of these stars, but he could rattle off. You're talking about fourth liners, who played one season and then didn't make it out of their freshman year. He can tell you exactly what that guy did and what he's doing now, and the fact that he got his degree. And Bob's so proud of that, and so is his wife. And here's how he likes his casserole and all that. So it's those people really are such warriors for these programs. And look, star or not, first round draft pick or not, you're still a kid. You're still 18. You're still frankly scared shitless, and you're away from, even if you lived with a billet family, it's different. Because you're going to college, it's a big stage. There's a lot of people watching. There's a lot of pressure on you, and then you do have to pretend to be an adult at least some of the time. And so Bob really ended up being the safety net for them. And I always remember him talking about Blake having won the Hobie Baker, and he's sitting there like a proud uncle, like clapping his ass off, and just he could not have been prouder of the growth that Blake had undergone, especially him, because he was a guy who came in as a hothead and then also could have bailed on the program early and ended up staying all 4 years, winning a Hobie and being, kind of an all-American too.
Now, there's more I want to get into on this. We need to take a quick break for a commercial. We'll come back after the commercial, and we'll get right back into this and so much more. It's fascinating stuff. So please stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. I'm joined again by Sam Jefferies, author of Legacy on Ice, a Blake Geoffrion story. So before the break, we were talking a little bit about the grassroots portion of the game and billet families, and you brought up the Hobie Baker that Blake Geoffrion had won. What did that mean to not just him and the program, but to the school and the local community?
Yeah, I mean, the Hobie Baker is a huge deal, and there are a lot of incredible players who come through Wisconsin who had never won it. I mean, the fact that Chris Chelios played in Madison, played for the Badgers, and had an unbelievable collegiate career, and yet never won the Hobie, it's just an example of that level of talent, right? Let alone, I mean, Mike Rick, Mike Richter, the Richter Award for best college hockey goaltender is named after him, and yet he didn't win the Hobie, right? I mean, it's just, I think there was a lot of almost leading up to that. And so for Blake to win, and for him to be a fourth year senior at a time, especially when 4 year players are becoming increasingly rare, to have stuck with the program, they've taken him the national championship, and won the Hobie and really become that guy for the program was a huge deal for the community. And I think even Blake has forgotten that sometimes. And I mentioned earlier, he and I being back in Madison back in the fall, and a lot of people came out and shook his hand and talked about what it meant to watch him and what it meant to have him bring that trophy back to Madison. And they've won 6 national championships. They've got a pretty healthy trophy case, and that was the first one as an individual to win the award, and to do it in a way that I think was indicative of who Blake was a player, is an all-around guy, right? I mean, a 200-foot center, who's willing to be in front of the net and get greasy goals, and had this monster slap shot, and was willing to sacrifice his own points in order to bird dog, great players who were coming into town and all that. That is remembered so distinctly by, in Wisconsin. And then there's no pro team there, right? And so just like parts of Canada, that the juniors lore is so more important than the pro lore. College hockey is like that for Wisconsin in a lot of ways, and Blake is that guy, to this day for sure.
Now, I know that there's in your research there was a ton of stuff that you had to leave out. Was there any one portion of that NCAA time frame or level that was in the book but had to get left out?
Yeah, I mean this is NCAA. It goes back a little before Blake's time, but there was this incredible story of, they call it the greatest fight in college hockey history, and this absolute brawl between Wisconsin and North Dakota at Wisconsin at the old Dane County Coliseum. And they ended up, it spills over out of the rink, and they ended up into the stands, and the opposing players are fighting the fans, and the cops get involved and everything else. Um, and that comes at a time when Wisconsin, Minnesota, and North Dakota were trading national championships basically every year for a 7 or 8 year period. And so, there's this amazing dynastic run as well between these three programs, and that's at the heart of it. And then the stick boy, Rob Andringa, who actually passed away while I was researching this book, and was an early interview for me, and just an all around great guy. Um, he's a 13-year-old stick boy shitting his pants in the middle of that fight, and then he goes on to win a national championship with Wisconsin in 1990, and then he becomes a mentor for Adam Burrish, who is the captain for the 2006 national championship winning team, and then goes on to win a Stanley Cup in Chicago in 2010 with Patrick Kane, who's Blake's roommate in the NTDP. So there's I think the conclusion of that is there's about 10 people who play hockey in the world, and they're all in this book. So it's a small world, as you know, it's a small
Yeah.
community, but a really really cool thing to see that all the way through, and to see the NCAA is a big part of that. Wisconsin at the center for this story for sure.
I think that's kind of it kind of points to the passion of players and fans and the sport itself because it's it's a story that you hear replayed in a bunch of different areas over and over again. We've had
Yep.
that where I grew up, and you mentioned this gigantic brawl and kind of spilling into the streets. But if you look at Blake's family history with the legacy, the Richard riots that you mentioned earlier,
Oh yeah.
somewhat similar. It really it's a universal thing in the sport, it seems, that sometimes we just can't seem to control ourselves.
I mean, it's a fast game and it's a
Yeah.
tough game, and tempers run hot. And I think, um, and there's whole debate about fighting and what place it has in the sport, but um, it is hard to control that. I mean, there's almost no fighting in college hockey anymore. They all got cages, and I remember watching a fight at Wisconsin. They're playing North Dakota, and the guy's got the other guy by the shoulder. He lets go. He takes the cage, opens it up, and punches him through it. And like, these guys will do anything to find a way to get there, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that they are these moments that we remember, and they define seasons. And I was even watching a hockey night in Canada earlier this year, and Kevin Bieksa talking about the line brawl back in 2014 when Tortorella was coaching the Canucks, and they do end up defining these moments and being markers for history, and just a reminder of how much we all care. And if this is how much we care, then how much the players really care.
It really does. It really does ex put an accent grave on there, the big exclamation mark on it.
Totally.
Now, this legacy clearly Blake has been. He's been handed this massive legacy that no one else has ever had to shoulder. Um, but in your book, you talk about his years growing up where he was completely unaware.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he grows up in the South, right? And if you have Canada and then the United States as far as hockey fanaticism, then you've got the American South way down here, right? Geoffrion name or not, but the Predators are come to town just as he is starting to play serious hockey. And just to goes to show you like what they were trying to build is when they rolled out the home sweaters, the first Predators home sweaters. Barry Trotz called Danny Geoffrion and said, "Hey, I'm doing this sweater rollout at the mall near you. Could you have a couple of your boys come and wear them?" And there's pictures of like an 8-year-old Blake Geoffrion drowning in this giant jersey and standing next to Barry Trotz in like 1997. And it's a reminder of same like I was saying about keepers of this memory that Barry Trotz knew who the Geoffrions were, right? And he called them, and it was such a signature moment. And then I remember Blake's mom telling me this story about how the kids used to go to the Predators games, and Blake and his brothers could go down to the locker room. They basically had carte blanche to go down to the locker room, and they'd make tape balls and all that, and be hanging out with the players. And I just want to be like, do you understand what a like bizarre and remarkable thing it is that you're a 10-year-old kid just walking into an NHL locker room? But he never thought about it because that was everybody knew his dad, everybody knew his grandfather, and the door was open. And it really took, it took that trip to Montreal, and I don't want to give away the whole book, but they go for the number retirement ceremony of Boom Boom, and he passed away early that morning. So it ends up being a memorial and a retirement ceremony. And Blake is standing there, on the ice in the Bell Center. His dad is speaking, his uncle is speaking, and the place is silent except for the tears. And he just like he could not square that with his grandfather, right? With the grandfathers, like, and this guy that had been in his life. But that's, I think, when he really started to understand, and it happens just as he is chasing a gold medal at the U18s and being recruited for college hockey, and becoming a very serious player at those levels of the sport. And then of course when he gets traded to Montreal and really understands, the old Brian Burke quote, when you lose in Montreal, you suck in two languages. And that is very true. And it's even
It
more
is.
true if you're a Geoffrion. So I talked to Max Pacioretty, interviewing this book, or interviewed him for researching this book. And even he, as the captain, and as a captain in some pretty high scrutiny years in particular, had a lot of sympathy for Blake.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Max was always one of my favorite players in that entire era,
Yeah,
because of how he played and how he held himself to a
yeah,
higher standard. So to have him around, I think that might have helped Blake a little bit, um, just because as a fellow American
yep,
and having that understanding. But back to Blake's youth, though, if he wasn't a Geoffrion, if it was just Blake Smith, and he was the first kid from Tennessee drafted by the Predators, which he was,
yeah.
that was that's a huge story in itself.
Oh
So
yeah.
I don't know how Blake is able to collect all these massive things and still move ahead. Like, well, he must
I honestly,
be.
I don't have a good answer for you because I think he's pretty good about compartmentalizing it, and he's pretty good about
Yeah,
playing his game. And his struggles on ice were not often linked to those things. And I think it kind of hits him in waves. And then I think he put a lot of it in a box too. And it was a really interesting part of this process for him to read early drafts and say, have that moment that when he gets a hat trick in Nashville and cements that you can be a kid from the South and make it in the pros. And all of the Nashville kind of youth hockey community remembers that as a signature moment and still does to this day. He remembered what a big deal it was to be stopped in the street and thanked for what he brought to that. And then, now the Predators are the Predators, right? This is their 25th anniversary season. They're a very serious program. They're perennial contenders in the playoffs a lot, and hockey is a big deal in that area. But he was the first, and it is, that's its own legacy to carry. And that's, again, as you said, before you even get to the last name. Now, I don't think you get there if Danny Jeffrion's not your dad, because when he was a kid in the 90s, you you would not have been able to bring that level of talent through Nashville. It was too amateur. There wasn't enough ice, and there weren't enough, good coaches and programs. But here's Danny teaching him in the way that he knew best and had brought to the States. But now you could do it today, right? My son's 6. He plays youth hockey. If we ended up in Middle Tennessee tomorrow, he's got just as good a shot as he does elsewhere, because, in part because of what Blake proved that you could do.
Well, it's this the NHL expansion to the Sun Belt states and all
Oh yeah.
these non-traditional markets. That's a legacy that was made by his ancestors who popularized the sport. And now he's created his own legacy within the state, being the first local kid to make it and prove you can do it. So it's kind of a it's just it's just a beautiful story of what the flow of it. And you talked about his father teaching him how to play. There's got to be some stories about him in the backyard with his dad learning to shoot, because that shot that Blake has, you can watch video of his grandfather and his father. It's identical.
Oh, I got hair standing up on the back of my neck thinking about it. It is unreal to see him swing that stick high, and yeah, he really talks about Boom Boom um teaching him that. And there's this great story that um uh Boom Boom ends up flipping the stick over. He goes, "That's not, I can't do the Quebec accent, but that's not the way you shoot the puck. This is the way you shoot the puck." And he flips it over and he's shooting it backwards. And he puts the street puck through the fence, and breaks it, and hands him the stick back, and he goes, "That's how it's done." And then there's Danny looking at the brand new fence he put up, and there's a hole in it, and they end up leaving that hole until Boom Boom passed away, because it was such a memory, right, of that being passed down. But yeah, I mean, it is hard to overstate what it means to sit there with a Hall of Famer, not be intimidated by it, because he is just your grandfather, and then be taught in that way about how to, how to bring that power, and how to split a back of a net wide open. So pretty cool.
So and you talk about that and his path to the NHL, and now he gets traded to Montreal, of
Hmm.
all cities to get traded to.
Right.
Would what did he talk about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, he first thing he did was call his father, and Danny first reaction was, why did it have to be Montreal? And really, really feeling for his son, knowing the pressure that he had been under, and what it meant, the weight of wearing that sweater, and of carrying that logo, and then knowing too that as much as Blake thought he understood what it meant to be a Geoffrion, that he was going to come to a new abrupt understanding. And so he goes, and he's playing some in Hamilton, and then ends up getting a call up, and it is an unbelievable moment to be able to inherit that. And I think at a pretty comfortable time, if there is such a thing, playing for the Habs. where there wasn't so much pressure to win. He's not getting traded in the middle of a playoff run.
Yeah.
And so, playing with Pacioretty and others, and then coming up with Gallagher and this really impressive younger cohort, being a glimpse of what the future might be, and that maybe the future is grounded in another Geoffrion. And so I think he does a lot of grappling with that, and then because of the lockout, he it ends up being put on the shelf for a bit, and then of course gets injured. So it's a really interesting moment where he is really starting to understand the meaning of that legacy to the people he's playing in front of, and really what he owes his family name as well, in addition to the fans and the community.
Now, you talked about his burgeoning awareness. What the decision of wearing the number that he wore when he was in Montreal,
Yeah,
57. Clearly, for for those who listen or they're Habs fans, they understand the significance of the number 5 and the number 7.
yeah.
Obviously, the family legacy. Was this his choice, or was this something that was brought to him?
100% his choice. And he had worn 5 for Boom Boom in college when he could, when he became a senior, he got to choose his number and all that. And made that choice consciously when he went to Montreal. And I think that was a great indicator, right, of that understanding. And but I mean, I just cannot imagine, number, and you look up, and there they are. They're the 2 numbers, and there's this incredible story of when they retired Boom Boom's number, they bring Howie's number down both halfway, and then they raise them into the rafters together. And like, nobody does hockey theater like the Canadiens. I mean, I've been, and it is true magic. I don't need to tell anybody who's listening to this podcast, but there are levels, and this is for me at the very top, that there is there is a power and a chill to that, and to him having made that choice, knowing what it meant to carry, and then being reminded of it every single game.
Now, I remember watching him play in Montreal and in Hamilton back then, and
Mm-hmm.
I was watching him and thinking, this is a kid who's going to have a good long career. Not He wasn't going to be a Hall of Famer, but he was
Yep.
going to be a very good player for a long time. And then the unfortunate incident where he got injured, uh, playing in the Bell Center underneath those banners.
Yep.
It just, I can't, well, I can based on my main career, but what, you talk to the family, what was going through their minds and their hearts at the time that this happened?
Yeah. Well, his parents ended up being in the stands for that game, which is a wild thing. They got 4 boys, and one of them was playing college hockey, and was playing in Boston area that weekend. And so they said, okay, we're gonna go up to Montreal, and then we're gonna go to Boston from there, and we'll see them both play. And they had no business being there otherwise, right? They live in Tennessee. It's not an easy thing. And they happened to be there, happening watching, and he goes down. Interestingly, the guy who checked him and whose skate ends up clipping him is Jean-Philippe Cote. His father played with Danny in the Quebec Major Juniors back in the day. So once again, there's 10 people who play this sport. They all know each other. But his parents are in the stands. They're watching. He goes down. He's clutching his head, and his mom thinks, "Oh no, it's another concussion," which is such a hockey mom comment, right? Like clearly she's been here before. She knows what the
Yeah.
deal is. She's concerned, but she's not worried. Um, and then he stands up, and you can see the blood dripping from his head, and you can see it more, really clearly on the ice. And they get a call from the team, and they said, "What section are you in? We're coming to get you." And then they really, it hits them that this is not another concussion, that this isn't a run-of-the-mill injury. And so they end up, Danny and Kelly end up riding in the back of the ambulance with him, and they're flying through downtown Montreal, and the sirens are on, and it really, every bump in the road starts to set in that this is this is an emergency, that this is truly a devastating moment. And then they get to the hospital and they feel okay. And then the nurse comes out and says, he's seizing. We need your authorization to go into emergency surgery. And that's when it all comes crashing down for him. And Kelly is calling Blake's now wife, Caitlin, his girlfriend, or his fiance at the time, and can barely speak about what's happening. And I'm a parent, your parent. I mean, I cannot imagine what that would feel like. And it's almost worse to be so close to it, right? There is no mystery. I mean, they are sitting right outside the surgery. They're sitting right in the stands as it happens. And, it's just an absolutely devastating moment. And then, fortunately he survives, and the surgery goes well. I spoke to the surgeon and to the trainer who took him off the ice, and but he's in Montreal for months after, just getting the strength to walk again. And his mother and his girlfriend stayed with him the whole time. And so his mom especially lives every moment of that too, and really being there to nurse him back to health, and to walk 100 feet a day every day for 60 days. Before he was finally well enough to get back on a plane.
Now, as horrible as that situation was, and I know the aftermath following that was no easy path, but you talk about his legacy on ice. I think that his legacy off ice from this might be more impactful because he went through a lot emotionally, mentally, and what he came back from is inspirational to many, many people. Like myself, I suffer from PTSD from my
Yeah.
time and my injuries, and seeing someone like Blake go through the same thing and then come out the other side as successful as he has been
Oh
is an
yeah.
inspiration.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I'll say a credit to Blake for being so forthcoming in our conversations and in my research, because he didn't have to share. When I called him up, he didn't know me from Adam, and he didn't have to share that depth of things he did. And he ends up really getting into it with me, and it's reflected in the book. But I think the way he spoke about the isolation, which struck me in such a significant way, is that Caitlin's doing her best to keep an eye out for him, but she's got to go back to her life, and she's in law school at the time and everything else. And he is alone, and he's alone with those thoughts, those dark thoughts, and he is alone with some really, really traumatic injuries. And he I think, and I do go back to, we spoke earlier about his early days at the Culver Military Academy, but I do think some of that self-discipline that was instilled into him very early on ends up coming through and serving him so well, and just kind of by sheer force of will, turning things around, and changing the direction of his ship so that he can get back to living a real life, and to being there for the family that was there for him. So it's an incredible story, and one that it was such a gift to tell, really, because he and Caitlin and Kelly were really open books for me.
And as impressive as the family history is, as the accomplishments of the family are, I mean, even his wife becoming a lawyer, that's massive. All these accomplishments, everything comes back to the fact that all these people are just run of the mill, salt of the earth,
Yeah.
matter of fact people. And I think that really helps to uh, get people to attach to the stories, because no one wants to cheer for a bunch of jerks
Right. No, they
unless you're in
don't. And
Carolina.
Right, right. Oh yeah, then they're happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. It is a good family and good people. And they are really there for each other despite the noise and the the glitter and glam of being hockey royalty, frankly. And it's what makes them so relatable. And I wrote this book 9 times. And it went through a lot of editing, and each time I wrote it and I would take it back to the editor and they would say, there needs to be more Blake in it. Like the hockey is great, stories are great. Hearing about Ovechkin at the juniors or hearing about, knock around hockey in 1980s Tennessee is really fun. You got to tell us more about Blake because there is something about this guy and the way he interacts with the world. And it's not the most complex thing, but I do think it's a compelling thing. Um, and I continue to. And he and I have done uh, like I said, book signings and a couple things around the book promotion. Um, and he continues to just be incredibly gracious about our collaboration and the ability to tell an honest story.
Well, it really shines through in your book. All these, as all the stories that are coming across, everything at the base of it, you can tell it's just good, ordinary people who live extraordinary lives, and I think that's what makes it that much better of of a book. Um, with before I let you go, uh, in your journey of making this book, was there anything that you had faced or research that forced you to change your worldview on hockey or uh, the people in it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it researching the book and understanding that butterfly effect of these changes, right? And I mean, salary cap is a big change, right? I mean, a major change for pro hockey. But when you're coaching Kiwis, you don't think about that, right? You don't think about the effect. Certainly, and I was at college at Wisconsin in the late 2000s and started to watch these kids go earlier and earlier and leave the programs, and Kyle Turris being a one and done, and others like that. Um, and it is really striking and amazing to me that one line on page 75 of the CBA, or buried within the North American Development Model, or wherever it ends up being. I mean, um, hockey is in Nashville in part because General Motors decides to open up a plant there and brings all these unionized workers down from Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania to work it. Um, that for me was such a striking part of this process, and revealing for me was that we're in a constantly changing world, but it's not random. There are choices that are being made and that have significant effects for all of us, including all of us who love this game. And like I mentioned, my son's 6 years old. He's playing hockey, and I know that the hockey he's playing is being changed by the decisions that are being made, at the international level, at the professional level, at the NCAA level, and it is such an interesting thing for me to know that we're the masters of our own destinies, but we're not always making the rules of the game we play in. Um, and that has really stood out to me having written this book.
Well, Sam, I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your story, sharing the novel, talking a little bit about this. Uh, I I know there's going to be a lot more coming from you in the future on this story and dozens of others. So
Yeah.
I really look forward to that. And again, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I will be in Montreal in May. I'll be there May 9th at Indigo on Miguel Ave, signing books. So in the Montreal area, come say hi, buy a book, get it signed, talk a little hockey. Would love to do it because it's it's a special center of the hockey world for sure, and it'll be a treat for me to go back with this book in hand.
I can't wait to see that happen. And for those listening, I want to thank you for tuning in and listening. And remember, if you're talking about it,